It's going to be a very high-profile interview. I mean, a lot of people are going to watch it, and people will make up their own minds about it. I mean, I think that's the gain is his profile, is the access that he's been granted where others haven't been. But as I say, you have to ask yourself why that access has been granted. This has not been given because the Kremlin thinks, oh, this might be interesting for us to do. They are doing it because they think they're going to be able to amplify their message of propaganda. When we see the interview, we can finally judge, but certainly the promotional video that Tucker Carlson has done does not suggest that this is going to be a tough interview. To be quite honest, the harshest words he seemed to have were for other Western journalists, which he completely, without any evidence, accused of not trying to talk to Putin.
Not a single Western journalist has bothered to interview the president of the other country involved in this conflict, Vladimir Putin.
It's simply not true, and Putin's spokesman has himself said that they get lots of requests for interviews.
Господин Carlson не прав, но он, собственно, этого и не может знать. Мы получаем много заявок на интервью с президентом.
Tucker Carlson has been chosen for that. So I think, there are precedents for this in history. In the 1930s, as far back as that, the New York Times correspondent Walter Duranty is mostly remembered today. He was a very good reporter in many ways, but he's mostly remembered today for being soft on Stalin during a famine in Ukraine. So, and that's his historical legacy. So there is a history of people who decide to cozy up to the Kremlin, but they have to think too about how history is going to judge them. Because if this is taking a risk now, let us consider how this might come to be seen in the future. This at a time when the Kremlin has launched this massive invasion, the biggest attack by one country and another in Europe since the Second World War. And here you're going to go to interview the man who's responsible for launching that military operation. So you have to be pretty clear about how you're going to do this without simply appearing to be a mouthpiece for him. I honestly expect that we're just going to get Putin's line on the war, basically a variation of his theme that it's all NATO's fault and that the war is only being continued because NATO is an aggressor against Russia. And it's got nothing to do with the fact that he launched a massive invasion of a neighboring country. So I think, Tucker Carlson says, if he is going to try to do a proper interview, he's going to have to ask some pretty tough questions and not accept soft answers. But it's quite difficult to see that because let's be honest, the Kremlin does not give interviews like this because they think this is some sort of well-meaning contribution to international public debate. They give it because they think it's going to be a chance for them to get their propaganda amplified and probably reach another audience that they're not reaching at the moment. There is a massive risk here to Tucker Carlson's reputation. I'm not sure how much that means a risk amongst his base who may choose to believe what he says. But in terms of his legacy, in terms of what he's doing, and perhaps he doesn't quite realize actually what a sophisticated media operation he's dealing with the Kremlin. Mr. Putin, too, whatever one thinks of him, is a very consummate media performer. It's a truth that these days you can't be a major world leader unless you're good on TV. And he's had an awful lot of practice. Let's not forget, he's been at the top of Russian politics for a quarter of a century now. He started this out, 20-odd years ago when he started doing what were called webcasts then, talking to international audiences. So he's very practiced at this. And remember, too, television is his medium. It's something that we've seen through this war, where Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has perhaps been a bit more savvy in using social media. President Putin and a lot of his media team still seem to think a lot in terms of 20th century media, in terms of mass audiences, broadcast TV. This is a medium in which he's comfortable. So I think even if he does get questions that might seem tough, he'll be able to give answers, or he'll just use that classic politician's trick of answering a different question, to be quite honest. There's a big risk here. This, in a way, there's a long history of this, of people who've decided that they want to dissent from what they see as the conventional views of the Western media and go and talk to Russian leaders. But they end up, taking a big risk that they're just going to end up being mouthpieces for it. We've seen that Tucker Carlson has claimed, he's pointed out that no Western journalist has spoken to Putin for 2 years. There's a very simple reason for that. He doesn't want to talk to them. Even Mr. Putin's spokesman has said, in the last 24 hours, that there are lots of requests for interviews with the president, but they've decided to give Tucker Carlson an interview because they like his work. It was only within a week of the war starting, of course, we saw that infamous legislation that said that, spreading false information about the special military operation, you're still not really allowed to call it a war in Russia. Spreading false information, that means non-official information, about the special military operation, as the Kremlin termed it, could land you eventually with up to 15 years in jail. The big consequence of that, of course, is that many international news organizations, if they haven't left Russia already, altogether, they have significantly reduced the number of staff that they've got there. We've seen the infamous case of the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who's been detained for almost a year now, awaiting trial on espionage charges, which of course he and his organization vehemently deny. But it's a very, very difficult place. In effect, it is impossible to practice independent journalism there. It's not just Gershkovich either. There is the Radio Free Europe reporter Alsu Kumasheva, who's also in jail in Russia. So it's really, if you're going to start asking tough questions, you might find yourself in jail. I don't imagine that is going to happen to Tucker Carlson, and I imagine he's expecting to leave the country afterwards without any problems. Let's not forget, though, a lot of Russian journalists have had to leave the country because if they felt it was the only way to remain safe. I think there may be a perceived bias in the sense that Russia is seen as the aggressor in this conflict. Now, there are lots of lengthy historical reasons for it, and we've seen Mr. Putin using NATO enlargement since the end of the Cold War to justify that. But the immediate cause of this war is perfectly clear. It was Russia's decision to send troops into Ukraine with the hope of conquering it. That's failed already. We've seen that for 2 years. And if failing that, to hold on to large swathes of its territory. In the meantime, tens of thousands of civilians have been killed. We don't know how many combatants, hundreds of thousands, depending on whose figures you choose to believe, and massive damage to Ukrainian infrastructure and damage to property. So that is what this is really about. And I think the Kremlin is going to see this as an opportunity to speak to a Western audience or a certain section of the Western audience to justify their actions over the last 2 years. I mean, I think obviously one would imagine that given the very antagonistic relationship that the Kremlin has had with the Biden administration, given the Biden administration's extensive support for Ukraine, one would imagine that the Kremlin is looking at the upcoming US election and thinking, well, any change is probably better than this. Of course, during his previous term, Mr. Trump was criticized for being very soft on Vladimir Putin. There was a summit meeting they had in Finland in 2018, at which, there was already big discussions. This was not long after the Salisbury poisonings, and Trump was seen as having been very soft on Putin in that meeting when it took place. So I think that, the Kremlin will probably, in some extent, be hoping for a renewed Trump presidency. There's another way of looking at this, though. Vladimir Putin and his administration hate unpredictability. And I think Mr. Trump's foreign policy certainly can in some ways be seen as unpredictable. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. Whether Ukraine and whether American policy towards Russia is going to be a massive issue in the US election remains to be seen, but it is going to be an issue.